thinking or optimizing without the external framework of genes optimizing for reproduction? The question I ask myself as of today is the following. To which extent is my thinking modified by the somewhat indirect goal, one could say, of reproduction, not necessarily of myself, but the reproduction of my genes? One could also call this gene spread. So basically reproductive success, but not of myself again, but of my genes. As Richard Dawkins described it with the book title of his book, with the same title, The Selfish Gene. The gene is the basically entity that tries to, it doesn't try, because it is not something that is actually, that doesn't have any intentions, or one could only kind of humanize it, personalize it with assuming that it has intentions. But for the sake of simplicity of the sentences I produce, one could just say that the gene is the selfish part that tries to basically increase its reproductive success, and not so much me. But nonetheless, it seems to be the case, and I recently read a couple of books, not necessarily only in regards to this, but it seems to be more and more the case, or my understanding seems to more and more go towards the direction that there seem to be overarching goals which I cannot really influence. So I often then have been thinking about what is my role basically in me, what is my role in what I'm trying to do, and so on and so forth. And with the conclusions I got from these books. One recent book I read, or listened to rather, was How the Mind Creates Societies. I cannot remember the author as of right now. And what I took away from this book, which is not necessarily what the author wants me to take away from this book, it is just my interpretation, that basically, or to a certain extent, the society, or the societies we have, kind of reflect to a certain extent the mind, the structure of the mind, the incentives it operates on. And similarly, one could also say that Steven Pinker paints a similar picture with his book, with a similar book, which I also can't remember right now. I think it's called The Stuff of Thought, How Language is a Mirror to Our Soul, or something like this. Now, language, to a certain extent, seems to therefore reflect our thinking. So many metaphors, for example, are kind of giveaways for what the thinking behind these metaphors is. For example, thinking of something as sinister, thinking of something as dark, probably to a certain extent is influenced by the higher risk of being exposed to a less lighted place in the night. And that might come from basically other people, that might come from other predators, the higher risk. And so it seems to kind of reflect a calculation. And the calculation is that if things are darker, there is basically more unknown, and the more unknown there is, the less able one is to predict what will be the outcome of a certain situation. Therefore, maybe one wants to avoid the unknown, because, well, it could lead to death. Now, back to the main topic here. The main topic of to which extent thinking is then influenced by these overarching goals. Recently, I heard someone describe, I can't remember what it was, I have tried to think about this, who it was to ascribe the quote to, then the right someone. But the thing they said or mentioned was this: you can't choose what you do, kind of. I'm also rephrasing, I think, but you cannot choose what you want. So what do I want? I don't really, I don't really actually know. I am just doing these things because I think they are useful. Now, to a certain extent, one could also interpret the whole consciousness thing. So I've listened to a few books that describe kind of consciousness, maybe on the side of Sim Harris, maybe on the side of going towards artificial intelligence, and in which way artificial intelligence, or the attempted generation thereof, then reflects on the human mind. But the question I ask myself again, maybe this is just another recurring question, was to which extent, for example, the overarching goal of reproductive success, or the reproductive success of my genes or everybody else's genes, is influencing all of my thinking. So let's just take an example. As a substep of as a substep of basically reproductive success of my genes, so basically the program defines a goal, not the program. The program I run, or I'm basically running different algorithms, one could say. The master algorithm, or the code, is kind of my DNA, one could say. Now, there are multiple programs that apply to certain situations, and there are also multiple models of reality, and the models of reality also seem to somewhat update as I continue to go through life, maybe also other people. So there also seem to be multiple different things that basically contribute towards maybe different things. So let's just say, okay, the human mind is to a certain extent an optimization machine, because it tries to basically strive towards these goals of reproductive success and everything that comes with it. Maybe there are also other goals. Maybe it's also, one could also say, somebody has an intrinsic goal of trying to learn about the environment. One could then maybe say this is just a sub-part of the program that then leads again to reproductive success, because if I can learn new things, then the models of my reality become more accurate. Therefore, I'm able to predict basically reality better. Therefore, whatever I do will basically be more effective as I go through time and basically space with a better model of reality, and therefore I'm able to, with a given amount of resources, get more things done, or get the same things done faster. So the question then is, to which extent does this overall framework basically, if one thinks, for example, or one just takes the analogy, or makes up the analogy that I have to go to Rome. Rome is basically the overarching goal. This could also be another goal. Maybe there are beings that don't have reproductive success as the overarching goal. But if I now need to go to Rome, and I go to I start from, let's just say, from the North Pole, and I go towards any direction. Then if I go into the wrong direction, then if the program is somewhat smart, then eventually it will kind of stir me off this direction I am going into, or I'm going towards, in order to then bring me more towards Rome. So if one optimizes for a goal, to a certain extent, by rewarding or also by penalizing a certain type of behavior, one could drive a certain entity more towards the goal, basically. So in terms of artificial intelligence, there seem to be several attempts at basically, so one learning approach seems to be the following, that a neural network or things of a similar kind, I don't know what actually was referred to in the book, are basically generating random responses to something. And then one has a reward function that then says, okay, this was good, and this was good, and this was good. One could also run the program against itself. So what I've heard is that DeepMind by Google was kind of competing against itself at any given level. So it always basically had a counterpart that was as equally trained as basically the entity itself, which of course is kind of maybe a genius thing, which also led to the thought that maybe I should just work against myself all the time in some way or another, or find an implementation of this, or multiple implementations of this concept. Well, back to this thinking part. If now I head from the North Pole into a different direction, then if I have something like this, either a positive or a negative reward function. Now the reward function by definition is kind of more positive. You could also say a penalizing function. Let's say I get an electroshock whenever I go into the wrong direction, and maybe the electroshock is scaled basically to how much I steer into the wrong direction, and it gets less intense if I go into the right direction. Then over time, I basically, as I just try random things, let's just say there are 360 possible directions I can go into. Then every time I try, and I then take the direction with the least electroshock. If I do the whole circle, but if I now just, if I don't do this, of course this is time consuming to then rotate around and check basically every degree. But what one also could do is just go into one direction and just take a step. And then one could basically, as one takes steps, one also has basically different values that then are attributed to these vectors in terms of scaling electric shock up or down. In terms of the penalizing function, one could also say I don't know, I feel more happier, for example. I feel happier if I go towards this goal. In terms of reproduction, one could say that this happiness function is actually kind of what stirs us toward maybe going for the right partner, or maybe not. This was just another idea. So the question now is, if one takes away the overarching goal of going to Rome, what is left? The overarching goal in our case might be optimizing for reproductive success. So we have maybe an overarching optimization function, and this might be reproductive success, not of ourselves, but of our genes, and maybe it's not even our genes, but sub things on our genes. Maybe it's not actually anything, but it is just like statistics, and we just do things and resource accumulation, and we just happen to be here, and then something else happens to be there, and because they're there has some way that accumulates resources more efficiently, and then is able to, I don't know, if the next animals, for example, would be rocks, and the rocks would be more efficient in making, I don't know, more rocks, or in making the world into a rock, then this would be kind of the thing that exists. Or a black hole would be the thing that exists, because it accumulates matter, and then it accumulates more matter. And so it seems also ridiculous that basically just by statistics, by random allocations of things, and by random allocations of matter, and also we are mostly empty, then evolution came up with this, but evolution actually is not really a process. It is just things happening, and then more things are happening, and more things are happening. And the question then remains to a being like myself, that then is this resource accumulator, one could say, with DNA inside, to which extent then my thinking, what would it be without the overarching optimization goal, without me striving for this goal that is actually laid upon myself by an external entity, and I am just the agent that is kind of living in my small world within this.